Open any American cookbook from 1850, 1890, 1930, 1960, or 1985. Each one is a time machine, not just for recipes, but for what America believed about women, economics, science, and family. Here's what they quietly tell us, if we slow down long enough to listen. Pull one off the shelf. You know the feeling. The crack of a tape-repaired spine. So loud, it sounds like the book itself is clearing its throat. Butter-splattered pages that refuse to lay flat. A child's handwritten note in the margin, in pencil, in a careful grade school script, next to her mother's recipe for peach cobbler. And that scent, that specific scent of vanilla extract-soaked index pages, mingled with cinnamon and flour dust and whatever furniture polish her kitchen shelf wore in 1962. A cookbook is a ledger of small domestic hours, but it is also, quietly, a national document. And if you read them in order, all of them, generation after generation, a story emerges that no textbook will teach you. Because a cookbook, you see, is not a neutral thing. A cookbook is a mirror. It reflects back what a country thought women were for, what the economy demanded of a pantry, what science had lately discovered, and what a family was supposed to look like when it sat down to eat. The recipes are almost beside the point. The real history is in the margins. The advice, the warnings, the silences, the things a 1953 housewife is not told, and the things a 1977 home cook is suddenly allowed to say out loud. So let us begin at the beginning. Let us begin in a country that had only just finished being a country. The year is 1796. George Washington was still alive. The ink on the Constitution was barely dry. And in Hartford, Connecticut, a woman we know almost nothing about, a woman who described herself only as an American orphan, published 47 pages that would change how a nation cooked. Her name was Amelia Simmons. Her book was called American Cookery. And it was, as far as we can tell, the first cookbook written by an American, for Americans, using American ingredients on American soil. Think about what that meant. Before Amelia Simmons, every cookbook in the colonies had been imported. English. They called for ingredients that did not grow here. They assumed a kitchen in Surrey, not a kitchen in Connecticut. They had no use for pumpkin, no word for cornmeal, no instructions for cranberries. Amelia Simmons looked at the pantry of the New World, the corn, and the squash, and the turkey, and the maple, and she wrote them down. She gave us the first printed recipe for pumpkin pudding. She was the first to use the word cookie from the Dutch koekje in an American book. She was, in 47 quiet pages, inventing a cuisine. And already in 1796, the cookbook is doing its secret work. Amelia Simmons is telling young women, orphans like herself, that they do not need a wealthy English mother to teach them how to run a kitchen. A book can be the mother. A book can be the inheritance. A book can be the bridge between the country that was and the country that is becoming. The American cookbook, from its very first breath, is a document of self-reliance. Now, jump forward almost a century. Close that slim pamphlet of Amelia's and open something heavier, something corseted, something Victorian. The year is 1884. Mrs. D.A. Lincoln, Mary Johnson Lincoln, has just published Mrs. Lincoln's Boston Cookbook, and the shift in tone is astonishing. This is no longer the cookbook of a frontier. This is the cookbook of a parlor. Mrs. Lincoln is writing for a new kind of American woman, the urban, middle-class, educated housewife, and she assumes her reader has a stove with an oven, running water, a pantry, and hired help. The book is organized like a science textbook. There are chapters on the chemistry of cooking, the composition of meats, the principles of digestion. Food has become a subject of study, and the Victorian American home has become a small laboratory with lace curtains. And then, 12 years later, one of Mrs. Lincoln's own students, a young woman who had survived polio as a child and walked with a limp, would take that laboratory approach and perfect it. Her name was Fanny Merritt Farmer. Her book, published in 1896, was The Boston Cooking School Cookbook, and with it, she changed American cooking forever. Here is the thing people forget. Before Fanny Farmer, American recipes were written in a kind of poetry. A handful of flour, a lump of butter the size of an egg, a teacup of milk, a pinch of salt, enough sugar to sweeten. Cook until done. These were recipes written by women who had cooked the same dish 1,000 times, written for other women who could be trusted to feel their way through a kitchen. They assumed inherited knowledge. They assumed a mother stood at your shoulder. Fanny Farmer looked at that tradition and saw a problem. She saw all the brides who did not have mothers at their shoulders. The immigrant daughters, the factory girls, the young women whose families had scattered from farm to city. She decided that cooking should not depend on touch and memory. It should depend on numbers, precision, a level teaspoon, a measuring cup, a clock. Pause there, because this is one of the quiet revolutions in American history, and nobody ever calls it that. In 1896, Fanny Farmer invented, or rather standardized, the measured recipe. 1 cup of flour, meaning exactly 1 cup, leveled off with the flat of a knife. 1 teaspoon of baking powder, not a dash, not a pinch, 1 teaspoon. She was accused at the time of being cold, mechanical, unromantic. Critics said she was turning cooking into arithmetic. And she was. On purpose. She was democratizing the kitchen. She was telling every young woman, in America, you do not need to have been raised in the trade. If you can read, you can cook. By 1915, the Boston Cooking School Cookbook had sold more than 300,000 copies. It is still in print. It is arguably the most influential single cookbook in American history. And every time you use a measuring spoon, you are using Fanny Farmer's 19th century idea. And here is something worth pausing on. Fanny Farmer did her teaching in an era when American science itself was booming. The home economics movement, led by women like Ellen Swallow Richards at MIT, was arguing that the kitchen deserved the same rigor as the chemistry lab. Cookbooks in the 1890s begin including calorie counts, protein percentages, and nutritional tables. Food becomes a matter of citizenship and health. A well-fed nation was, they argued, a strong nation. Open a cookbook from 1898, and you will find a recipe for boiled beef, followed by a paragraph on nitrogen content. The country had fallen in love with measurement, and the cookbook was its favorite textbook. But look a little closer at those 1890s cookbooks, hers and her peers, and you will see something else happening in the margins. Something political. Pour yourself a glass of water, because this is where it gets interesting. In earlier American cookbooks, wine in cooking was ordinary. Sherry in the consomme, brandy in the fruitcake, Madeira in the gravy, entirely unremarkable. Then, suddenly, in the late 1880s and 1890s, wine begins to vanish. Recipes are reformulated. Footnotes appear instructing the cook to substitute grape juice, or milk, or water. Whole categories of dishes disappear quietly from the table. Why? Because the Women's Christian Temperance Union was not just a political movement. It was a publishing movement. It reached into the kitchen. And the kitchen is where it did some of its most permanent work. You're reading the temperance movement, right there, on the page of a pot roast recipe. The cookbook has become a battlefield for the American soul, and most of the soldiers are women with wooden spoons. Now turn the page. It is 1901. A 33-year-old Milwaukee woman named Lizzie Black Conder is running a night school for Jewish immigrant girls from Eastern Europe. She has noticed they cannot find their ingredients in American stores, cannot read the American labels, cannot decipher the American measurements, cannot navigate the American kosher laws loosening around them. So she types up a little booklet of recipes and asks the men of her community to fund the printing. The men refuse. She raises the money herself from advertisements. She prints it anyway. The book is called The Settlement Cookbook. Its subtitle, unforgettable, is The Way to a Man's Heart. It is, on the surface, a cookbook. Underneath, it is an assimilation manual. It teaches immigrant women how to cook American food, how to shop in American stores, how to run an American household while still observing Jewish tradition. It becomes one of the best-selling American cookbooks of the 20th century. It sells more than 2 million copies. It funds the settlement house movement for decades. And it tells you, on every page, what it meant to become American in the first decade of the 20th century. It meant learning to make Parker House rolls and still keeping a kosher kitchen. It meant both. The cookbook held both. And then the world went to war. Open a cookbook from 1917 or 1918, and you will find a strange new vocabulary. Wheatless Mondays, meatless Tuesdays, porkless Saturdays. Suddenly, there are chapters on substituting cornmeal for wheat flour, because white flour is being shipped to feed the soldiers in France. There are recipes for war bread, victory loaves, Liberty cake. Mrs. Wilson, who published Mrs. Wilson's Cookbook during the war and followed it with Mrs. Wilson's Mother's Cookbook in 1924, wrote entire sections on cooking with substitutes, on stretching meat, on making sweets without sugar. Herbert Hoover, before he was president, was the nation's food administrator, and he reached straight into American kitchens through cookbook authors like Mrs. Wilson. Patriotism, in 1918, looked like a corn muffin. The cookbook became an arm of the government, and when the war ended, it never quite gave that role back. Now, something very important happens next. The 1920s glitter by with their flappers and their cocktails and their new electric refrigerators. And then, in October of 1929, the stock market collapses, and an entire country falls into a dark kitchen with not quite enough in the pantry. What happens to the American cookbook in the Depression is one of the most moving stories in American publishing. In 1931, a widowed St. Louis woman, recently bereaved, was trying to figure out what to do with the rest of her life. Her husband had just died by suicide, leaving her with grown children and a modest inheritance and a terrible grief. Her name was Irma Rombauer. She was not a professional cook. She was a hostess, a socialite, a woman known in her circle for her dinner parties and her wit. Her daughter Marion urged her to write a cookbook. She had $3,000 of her late husband's savings. She used nearly all of it to self-publish a book she called The Joy of Cooking. Let that title sit with you for a moment. The Joy of Cooking. Published in the third year of the Great Depression, when a quarter of American workers had no job, when families were burning furniture for heat, when bread lines stretched around city blocks. And Irma Rombauer, grieving and nearly broke, writes a book whose entire premise is that cooking is a joy, not a duty, not a burden, a joy. It was, and is, one of the most quietly radical books in American history. Irma wrote in a conversational voice, as if she were standing next to you at the counter. She made jokes. She admitted when she had failed at a recipe. she invented a format called action cooking, where ingredients were bolded in the body of the instructions, so you did not have to read the recipe twice. It was a cookbook built for real women in a broken economy, and it was a lifeline. By the time her daughter Marion Rombauer Becker joined her for the 1951 edition, the book had become the cookbook of Middle America. It has since sold more than 18 million copies. And it began with a grieving widow in St. Louis, who decided the country needed permission to find joy in something as small as a pot roast. In that same era, something else was happening in Des Moines, Iowa. The Meredith Corporation, publisher of Better Homes and Gardens magazine, released in 1930 a loose-leaf, 3-ring binder cookbook with a distinctive red and white checkered plaid cover. The whole point of the binder was that you could add pages. You could clip recipes from the magazine and file them in. You could pass the book down with your own additions. It was a living document. Your grandmother's red plaid Better Homes and Gardens book, stuffed with yellowed clippings and handwritten cards and Christmas recipes taped onto the flyleaf, is one of the purest artifacts of American domestic life. Now, the Second World War arrives, and the cookbooks shift again. The wheatless, meatless days of the First World War return, this time with ration books. Sugar is rationed, coffee is rationed, butter, meat, canned goods, all controlled. Cookbook authors respond with ration-stretching recipes, with chapters on cooking with margarine, with tips for making 1 pound of beef feed 6. Victory gardens are celebrated in print. The government distributes cookbooks. Again, the kitchen is the front line. And here is a small, haunting thing worth noticing. If you flip through a wartime cookbook, you will sometimes find, penciled in the margin in a careful hand, the initials of a son or a husband overseas, and a date and a recipe she was saving to make for him when he came home. Sometimes the recipe is never dog-eared. Sometimes the page stays clean. The cookbook holds the absence too. It holds the meal that was never cooked. And then the war ends. The soldiers come home. The suburbs explode. The Cold War freezers hum to life. And we arrive at what I consider the single most revealing decade in American cookbook history, the 1950s. Step inside it with me. Pretend you are a 1950s bride, 22 years old, newly married, and you have just received, as a wedding gift, the Betty Crocker Picture Cookbook, published in 1950 by General Mills. You open it, and every single page, on every photograph, in every chapter introduction, tells you something specific about who you are now. You are, the book says gently and firmly, a wife, a homemaker, the keeper of a kitchen. Your husband comes home from work, and your job is to feed him well. There are chapters on how to plan meals so that he does not grow bored. There are tips on how to freshen up before he walks through the door. There are recipes labeled outright as dishes your husband will love. The gender role is not subtext. It is text. It is italicized. It is bolded. It is photographed in full color with a woman in pearls holding a casserole. And yet, if you read the Betty Crocker cookbook carefully, you will also see the first cracks. Betty Crocker, remember, was not a real person. She was invented by the Washburn-Crosby Company in 1921. By the 1950s, she had a face, a voice on the radio, a portrait updated every decade to reflect the modern American woman. And every time they updated her, they were recording in paint what America wanted its ideal woman to look like. Read those portraits in sequence, and you are reading a visual history of American femininity. That, too, is a cookbook. That, too, is a document. Take a breath. Because now we arrive at Julia. In 1961, Julia Child published Mastering the Art of French Cooking, and in 1963, she walked onto public television in Boston, 6 feet 2 inches tall, dropping a chicken on the floor, laughing and putting it back on the platter, and American cooking changed forever. In 1968, she published The French Chef Cookbook, collected from her television show. And what she did, without ever quite saying it, was blow the 1950s Betty Crocker cookbook apart. Because Julia did not cook to please a husband. She cooked because cooking was an intellectual pursuit, a craft, a pleasure for its own sake. She cooked while talking about the structure of a sauce, the chemistry of an emulsion, the history of a dish. She cooked as an equal, not a servant. She made it possible for millions of women to imagine the kitchen as a room of their own, the kitchen as studio, the kitchen as laboratory, the kitchen as theater, and the cookbooks that follow her reflect the shift. Craig Claiborne, the food editor of The New York Times, had been publishing his The New York Times Cookbook since 1961, and together with Julia, he helped make American food writing a serious genre. Criticism, biography, travel. Cookbooks stopped being instruction manuals. They started being literature. And then the 1970s arrive, and the cookbook explodes into a dozen different Americas. In 1977, a young woman in Ithaca, New York, working at a collectively run vegetarian restaurant, hand-lettered and hand-illustrated a cookbook using a rapidograph pen on her kitchen table. Her name was Molly Katzen. The book was The Moosewood Cookbook. It had no meat in it. None. It was a vegetarian cookbook, at a time when vegetarianism in America was considered eccentric, hippie, or faintly un-American. She drew the illustrations herself. She priced the recipes for communal living. She put recipes for lentil soup and cashew chili and spinach lasagna on the shelf next to Julia Child and Betty Crocker. And slowly, she changed the national palate. The Moosewood Cookbook has sold more than 3 million copies. It is, among many other things, a document of the 1970s counterculture, of the Back to the Land movement, of the feminist rebellion against the 50s housewife, of the hippie health revolution finding its way into suburban kitchens. If the joy of cooking is the cookbook of Depression survival, the East Moosewood is the cookbook of a generation that refused to cook like its mother. But the 1970s and 1980s did not belong only to vegetarians. In 1982, 2 women who ran a tiny gourmet food shop on Columbus Avenue in New York City published a cookbook that told a different story. Their shop was called The Silver Palette. Their names were Julie Rosso and Sheila Lukens. Their cookbook, The Silver Palette Cookbook, celebrated entertaining indulgence, sun-dried tomatoes, raspberry vinegar, chicken marbella with prunes and capers. It was the cookbook of the yuppie 1980s, of professional women with careers and dinner parties, of the specialty food movement, of balsamic vinegar arriving on American shelves. Between the Moosewood and the Silver Palette, you can map the entire argument of the 1980s American kitchen. Crunchy versus glossy, commune versus condo, bulgur versus brie. And in the 1990s, the cookbook went one more place. It went to the celebrity chef. The rise of the Food Network in 1993 turned chefs into household names in a way that even Julia had not quite managed. Emeril Lagasse, Wolfgang Puck, Bobby Flay. Their cookbooks became extensions of their television personas. And in 1998, a journalist named Mark Bittman, writing for the New York Times, published a thick, plain-spoken, encyclopedic book called How to Cook Everything. It was a kind of populist answer to the celebrity era. Bittman was saying, in effect, You do not need a chef. You need a book. You need the basics. You need to know how to roast a chicken. And he tried to put, between two covers, everything an American home cook would ever need to know. How to cook everything was a love letter to the middle kitchen, the weeknight cook, the parent of two. It was, in its way, the last great general-purpose American cookbook before the internet swallowed the genre whole, because that is what happened next. And we should talk about it honestly. By the early 2000s, a woman with a question about a recipe no longer reached for her grandmother's red plaid binder. She reached for a search engine. The cookbook, as a daily reference, was being quietly retired. Food blogs rose. Recipe aggregator sites rose. By the 2010s, half the country cooked from phones propped against the backsplash. The paper cookbook did not die. It became something else. A gift, a decoration, a love object. A thing you bought for the photographs and the essays, not for the instructions. The working cookbook, the splattered, dog-eared, used cookbook of everyday American life, was replaced by a screen that does not remember the cook who used it, does not carry her handwriting, does not hold her daughter's pencil marks, does not keep a record. And so we arrive at the present, with a question. What was lost? What was lost is not the recipes. The recipes are everywhere. You can find any recipe in 3 seconds. What was lost, quietly, is the archive, the household archive, the paper record of who cooked in this family, and what they cared about, and what they served on holidays, and what they substituted in hard times. When you inherit a search history, you do not inherit a life. When you inherit a cookbook, you do. Think of what a cookbook actually preserves, not the food. The food is eaten and gone. What the cookbook preserves is the hand of the woman who used it. The margin note that says, "Doubled the sugar, Ron likes it sweeter." The recipe card tucked into the chapter on pies that says, "Aunt Helen, 1958, her favorite." The grease stain that tells you this page was opened on the counter 1,000 times. The newspaper clipping yellowed to the color of old tea, a recipe for tuna noodle casserole torn from a 1962 Sunday supplement, folded twice, tucked between the pages, and forgotten for 60 years until you find it and hold it and smell the vanilla on your fingers. That is the history a cookbook holds. Not the recipes, the hands, the lives, the economies and the wars and the movements and the marriages that flowed through one kitchen and were recorded without meaning to be recorded, between the covers of a book. So here is what I ask you, this quiet evening. Find your grandmother's cookbook. I mean it. Walk to the shelf where it sits, or call your mother and ask where it ended up, or open the box in the attic where the kitchen things went when she moved out of the old house. Find it, hold it, open it, and read between the recipes. Read the handwriting in the margins. Read the newspaper clippings tucked inside. Read the stains that tell you which page she opened on Thanksgiving morning for 40 years. Read the substitution she wrote in during the war. Read the exclamation point next to the cake she made for your grandfather's birthday in 1958. Read the silences too, the pages she never touched, the recipes she never tried, the chapter on canning she skipped because she lived in the city now and did not need it. Because that cookbook, that splattered, tape-spined, vanilla-scented, butter-fingerprinted book, is not a collection of recipes. It is a letter from her, a letter she wrote without knowing she was writing it, a letter composed of dog ears and pencil marks and the careful check she drew next to the deviled eggs on page 114. A letter you can still open, still read, still answer, even now, even with her gone. Written slowly, over a lifetime, in the only private language a woman of her generation was ever given permission to write in. She did not know she was leaving you a memoir. She thought she was leaving you a cookbook. She was wrong, beautifully wrong. She was leaving you her life. And it is still there, waiting, on the page, for you to read it. So go, find it, open it, and listen. She's still talking.